Captain Alina Marshall stepped off the plane, feeling the weight of 14 months in the Middle East pressing against her shoulders. The dry heat of deployment had become second nature, the rhythm of military life an unshakable routine, but here back on American soil something felt foreign. The bustling airport was too chaotic, the voices too loud, the casual indifference of civilians a stark contrast to the discipline she had lived by every single day. She didn't belong here. Not yet. But her home was waiting. That thought alone grounded her. The one-bedroom house she had bought years ago, tucked into a quiet Texas neighborhood, was the only place that had ever been truly hers. It wasn't big or extravagant, but it was solid, reliable, just like she had always been. Dragging her duffel over her shoulder, she navigated through the terminal, her movements efficient, purposeful. She had traveled light, she always did. A military-issued rucksack, a battered old duffel with barely enough inside to last a week. The rest of her life, the things she hadn't needed while deployed, were back at the house. Stored neatly in the bedroom closet, the books on the shelves untouched, the coffee mugs in the cabinet waiting for her return. As she approached the rideshare pickup, she checked her phone, skimming through messages. One from her commanding officer, a brief but sincere acknowledgement of her return. Another from an old friend, inviting her for drinks, assuming she would be eager to drown herself in celebration. But Alina had never been one for crowds, and the only thing she wanted was to take a hot shower, sleep in her own bed, and feel, if only for a moment, that her life was still intact. The ride home was uneventful just the way she preferred it. Texas stretched out in front of her, familiar highways bathed in the golden hue of late afternoon. She watched as the landscape changed, the city fading behind her, giving way to residential neighborhoods, the kind where kids rode their bikes in the driveways and retirees tended to their perfectly manicured lawns. As the car turned onto her street, a flicker of relief settled in her chest. She was almost there. And then she saw it. Her house, or what was supposed to be her house, was occupied. At first, her mind refused to register what she was seeing. A different car in the driveway. A moving truck parked by the curb. Strangers, two men in paint-splattered overalls, were removing her windows, balancing them carefully against the side of the house. Another man, dressed in business casual, stood on the porch, clipboard in hand, casually flipping through pages as if he belonged there. As if this were just another routine task on his list. Alina felt her body go still. A cold and calculated stillness that had been trained into her over years of deployment. Something was wrong. This wasn't a mistake, wasn't a mix-up with a neighbor's house. That was her front porch. Her number was still on the mailbox. And yet, she was standing on the sidewalk, an outsider in her own life. She stepped out of the car slowly, her mind moving faster than her body. She wasn't armed, wasn't in uniform, but instinct screamed at her to assess the situation, control it. Her boots hit the pavement with deliberate weight, her shadow stretching long in the fading sunlight. The man with the clipboard glanced up, looking more annoyed than concerned. "Can I help you?" Alina's voice came out sharper than intended. "What the hell is going on?" He frowned, flipping a page, barely sparing her a glance. "And you are." She took another step forward, eyes locked onto him. "I'm the owner of this house." This time he actually looked at her, paused, considered, and then, with an irritatingly casual shrug, he said, "No, you're not." It took everything in her not to react, not to let the frustration, the confusion, the raw anger spill over. She exhaled slowly, pressing it down. "This is my house." He shook his head, flipping the clipboard around to show her a document, his finger tapping against the page. "Not anymore. This property was purchased at auction 3 months ago." She barely heard him over the blood pounding in her ears. "Auction?" Her voice came out dangerously even. "That's impossible." He sighed, as if this conversation was a waste of his time. "Foreclosure sale. House was put up for auction, and it was purchased legally." Foreclosure. The words sat in her chest like a weight, heavy and suffocating. She had made every payment. She had set up automatic transfers before deployment, had arranged for everything to be covered while she was gone. There was no way her house had gone into foreclosure. But then why was he standing here with legal documents? She ripped the clipboard from his hands before he could react, her eyes scanning the paper. A sale date. A winning bid. $1,000. $1,000. That was what they had sold her house for. Her vision narrowed. This is a mistake. The man was already retrieving his clipboard from her hands, clearly bored with her reaction. Take it up with the housing board. Alina turned, forcing herself to breathe, to think. There was no way in hell she was going to stand here and let this happen. She pulled out her phone, dialing the number for her bank, for the mortgage company, anyone who could explain how this was possible. But the second she gave them her name, the agent's voice turned detached. Distant. I'm sorry, but there is no record of that mortgage in our system. The world went still. Alina froze. Blinked, swallowed. What? The agent repeated it, slow and methodical. There's no record of an account under your name. She stared at her house, at the men working on stripping it down, at the clipboard-wielding asshole who had already moved on to discussing paint colors with a woman in a tailored blazer. Her house was gone. And someone had made sure there was no way to get it back. Alina stood motionless, phone still pressed to her ear, listening to the silence stretching between her and the bank representative on the other end. Her mortgage was gone. No record, no overdue balance, no foreclosure notice, just a black hole where her financial history should have been. It made no sense, but the growing unease in her gut told her it wasn't a clerical error. Someone had erased her existence from the system, or at least the part of it that would allow her to prove she had never been behind on payments. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay calm as she lowered the phone. Her grip on it was too tight, her knuckles white, but she barely noticed. She wasn't in a war zone anymore. She couldn't solve this problem the way she had solved others, through force, through decisive action, through immediate and tactical elimination of threats. Here the enemy wasn't holding a gun. They were hiding behind paperwork, legal loopholes, and bureaucratic walls too thick to tear down with brute strength. The man with the clipboard had already turned away, his conversation shifting to trivial details about the home's interior, discussing repainting options with the woman beside him, as if the rightful owner of the house wasn't standing 10 feet away. Watching her life be stripped apart like old wallpaper. Alina could feel the tightness in her jaw, the slow grind of her teeth as she clenched them together. She didn't move, didn't react, just observed, filing every detail away for later. She needed answers. Pivoting sharply, she stalked away from the house, ignoring the curious glances from the workers still removing fixtures from her windows. She would get nowhere arguing with them. The clipboard guy wouldn't care if she stood there all night screaming at him. But there was someone who had to answer for this, someone sitting in an office who had signed off on stealing her home. She pulled up the address for the local housing authority and got in the first available cab. It wasn't a long ride, but it felt endless, her pulse hammering in her ears. She kept replaying every possibility, every rational and irrational scenario, trying to find the missing piece that made this make sense. If it had been a mistake, a banking error, she would have received a warning, a letter, a notice of overdue payment. She had received nothing. By the time she arrived at the government office, her mind was no clearer, but her anger was sharper, honed into something cold and purposeful. She walked through the doors, shoulders squared, boots hitting the tiled floor with a deliberate weight that made people glance up as she approached the front desk. The receptionist barely looked at her, her fingers tapping lazily against the keyboard. "How can I help you?" Alina kept her voice level, controlled. "I need to speak to someone about my property. My house was sold without my knowledge, and I need to see the foreclosure records." The woman exhaled through her nose, uninterested. Name, Alina Marshall. There was a pause as the receptionist typed. The pause stretched. Then she frowned. "There's nothing under that name." Alina's patience, already frayed, nearly snapped. "That's impossible. I've owned that house for years." "Check again." It's a slow shake of the head. If you don't appear in the system, there's nothing I can do. The records update automatically from the county's financial database. If your property was foreclosed, it would be listed under the previous owner. But there's nothing here. Then check my mortgage lender. I can't. That information is private and only available to the registered property owner. Alina's vision darkened at the edges. I am the registered owner, not according to our system. She stared at the woman, debating the merits of reaching over the counter and pulling the monitor toward her just to see for herself. But it wouldn't matter. The information had been erased. Who signed the foreclosure order, she asked finally, voice flat. The receptionist hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. Ma'am, if you don't have a record in our system, I can't disclose information about the property. Alina inhaled slowly through her nose, pressing down the urge to slam her hands on the counter and force the conversation forward through sheer will. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked away, but she wasn't leaving. She scanned the office, the rows of desks beyond the glass partition, the stacks of legal documents piled high on the desks of people who had let this happen. She found him in less than 30 seconds, Thomas Berkeley. The name was printed neatly on the placard sitting on his desk. Foreclosure manager? She didn't stop at the glass door. She pushed it open, stepping into the office without an invitation. He looked up, startled, blinking behind thick-rimmed glasses as she strode toward him. You signed off on my foreclosure, she said without preamble, planting her hands on his desk. You're going to tell me why. His mouth opened and closed before he regained enough composure to sit back, lacing his fingers together. I'm sorry, who are you? Alina Marshall. My house was foreclosed while I was deployed. I had no debt, no missed payments, no notices, and yet my home was auctioned off for $1,000. Recognition flickered in his expression, a quick dart of his eyes toward the computer screen before settling back on her. If your property was foreclosed, the process was legal and documented. We don't make exceptions, even for he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. People in your situation. Her fingers curled into fists against the desk. You mean soldiers? I mean foreclosed owners, he corrected smoothly. Then show me the paperwork. He didn't move. I can't access that information without proper authorization. You had enough authorization to sign my house away, but not enough to tell me why. There was a slight twitch in his jaw, a minuscule crack in his carefully practiced composure. He wasn't expecting her. Wasn't expecting her to come here, to challenge him directly. Most people, she realized, probably accepted what they were told and walked away defeated. But Alina Marshall didn't know how to walk away. She reached across the desk before he could stop her, grabbing the stack of documents sitting by his keyboard. He lunged for them, but she was faster, eyes scanning the top page before he could snatch it back. A single line caught her attention. Transfer approved via discretionary override. Her stomach went cold. She met his eyes, and for the first time she saw something that hadn't been there before. Fear. He wasn't just a bureaucrat following protocol. He was in on it. She leaned forward, voice low even. Who ordered the override? He didn't answer. Didn't even blink. But his fingers curled so tightly together that his knuckles turned white. And that was enough. Alina straightened, stepping back, memorizing every detail of the document she had just read. She didn't need the paper. She had everything she needed. She turned and walked out of the office without another word. She had a name. Now she just needed proof. Alina left the foreclosure office with steady, controlled steps, but inside her mind was a wildfire, burning through every possible scenario that could explain what had just happened. She had walked in expecting resistance, bureaucratic deflection, excuses, the standard red tape, but she hadn't expected to see fear in Thomas Berkeley's eyes. The way his fingers clenched when she mentioned the override, the tension in his jaw, the carefully measured way he tried to steer her away from any real answers. He wasn't just an incompetent cog in a broken system. He was part of it, whether through negligence or something far worse. That alone confirmed what she had already suspected. This wasn't just a clerical error, wasn't a simple foreclosure due to unpaid dues or some forgotten fee. Someone wanted her house gone. Someone had planned this, orchestrated it down to the last missing document, ensuring she would return to nothing. She stepped outside into the dying light of the evening, the air thick with the heat of Texas in late summer. The world around her moved on, oblivious people coming and going from the municipal building, some arguing over traffic tickets, others clutching stacks of paperwork with the same weary frustration she had once thought was reserved for tax season and lost luggage. But what had happened to her wasn't some minor inconvenience. They had taken everything. She pulled out her phone, fingers steady as she dialed the only person she could trust to see through this mess, Jeremy Coleman, a former military attorney she had met during a joint operation years ago. He had since left the service, opening a private practice specializing in legal battles no one else wanted to touch. She didn't even know if he still practiced in Texas, but if anyone could pick apart the legal knots binding her to this situation, it was him. The phone rang twice before his voice came through, crisp, professional. Alina Marshall, he greeted, his tone betraying a note of curiosity. It's been a while. Not long enough, she muttered, running a hand through her hair as she turned away from the building, scanning the parking lot as if expecting someone to be watching. Maybe they were. I need your help. She heard the subtle shift in his breathing. Jeremy wasn't the kind of man to waste time on pleasantries if someone needed help. Where are you? Houston. My house, she exhaled sharply, still unable to say the words without feeling the weight of them pressing against her ribs. It was foreclosed while I was deployed. Sold for $1,000 at some backdoor auction I was never notified about. And now. The foreclosure office tells me there's no record of me ever having owned the place. My mortgage account doesn't exist. The title transfer was pushed through on a discretionary override, and the guy who signed it looked like he'd rather set himself on fire than answer my questions. Silence stretched between them for a beat, then another. When he finally spoke, his voice was unreadable. Where are you staying? She hesitated. Haven't figured that out yet. You need a place to lay low. That made her pause. Why would I? Alina, he said, voice low, controlled. If what you're telling me is true, someone buried you on purpose. That doesn't happen because of a clerical mix-up. That happens when someone with power wants you erased. If they've gone to this much trouble to make sure you don't exist, you think they're going to stop at just taking your house. She knew he was right. She had felt it from the moment she saw those men stripping down her home like it was nothing more than a structure with no history, no meaning. The car that had been parked outside her motel the night before. The way Thomas Berkeley's hands had trembled when she said the word override. Where are you? She asked instead. Dallas, he replied. Couple of hours from you. Come here. We'll figure this out. For a second, she hesitated. Every instinct told her to stay, to fight this battle where it had started, to keep pressing until she forced an answer out of the people responsible. But Jeremy was right, whoever had done this wasn't done with her yet. She hung up and got into a cab, giving the driver the nearest rental car location. If someone was watching her, she wasn't going to make it easy for them to track her movements. By the time she was on the highway, the sky had darkened into a deep shade of indigo, the headlights of passing cars illuminating her face in sharp intervals. She had always been good at reading patterns, finding weaknesses, tracking movements. Military training had made sure of that. And right now she could feel the invisible lines of this situation stretching out around her, a web of carefully placed obstacles meant to keep her from seeing the bigger picture. But she wasn't trapped in it. Not yet. She pulled onto the freeway, gripping the wheel a little tighter. She had spent her entire life fighting battles for other people, securing foreign territories, dismantling threats that had nothing to do with her own survival. And now, for the first time, the war was here. And it was personal. She arrived in Dallas a little after midnight, pulling into a side street near Jeremy's office. The building was dark except for a single light in the window above the entrance, and as she stepped out of the car, she caught sight of him standing just inside, watching her approach. He looked the same as he had years ago, sharp, lean, with that same air of contained calculation, as if every move he made had been measured 3 steps in advance. She stepped inside without a word, dropping her bag on the floor as she leaned against the desk. Tell me what I'm up against. Jeremy exhaled, moving around the desk to pull up a file on his computer. I ran a preliminary check before you got here. Whatever happened to your house, it's part of something bigger. The foreclosure board that approved the sale? They've processed over 200 discretionary overrides in the last year alone, all military, all deployed at the time of sale. Her stomach twisted. They're targeting us. They're targeting land, he corrected. Your house, the others like it, they're all sitting on prime real estate. Someone wants those properties off the books, scrubbed clean, so they can flip them for 10 times the value. She swallowed hard, the weight of it settling deep in her bones. This wasn't just about her home. It wasn't even just about the other veterans who had been stripped of theirs. This was a calculated operation, a system that had been built to exploit those least likely to fight back deployed soldiers, people who wouldn't see the notices in time, wouldn't be able to contest the sales until it was too late. Elena wasn't too late. She met Jeremy's gaze, her voice steady. Then, let's burn the whole thing down. He gave her a slow, sharp smile, and for the first time since she had stepped off that plane, she felt something close to certainty. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a war. And she intended to win. Elena sat in the dimly lit office, staring at the documents Jeremy had pulled up, her fingers tightening around the edge of the desk as she absorbed the full weight of what he was saying. The numbers on the screen weren't just an anomaly or some bureaucratic oversight, they were a pattern, a deliberate, methodical operation designed to strip deployed military personnel of their homes before they even had the chance to fight back. It wasn't just her house. It was hundreds of homes, all linked to the same network of fraudulent paperwork, discretionary overrides, and silent transactions that wiped out years of ownership with a few keystrokes. Jeremy leaned back in his chair, his expression dark. It's bigger than we thought. Your name isn't just missing from the mortgage system, it's been deliberately scrubbed. Whoever did this didn't just want your house. They wanted to make sure you didn't have a way to prove you ever owned it in the first place. Elena exhaled slowly, willing her pulse to steady. Who's behind it? He gestured to the screen. A holding company called Horizon Equity Partners has purchased nearly every foreclosed property on this list. Shell corporations, offshore accounts, legal loopholes, it's the kind of setup you see when people don't want to be found. The name meant nothing to her, but she knew the type. Corporate vultures who thrived on the exploitation of people who couldn't fight back. It was all about money, leverage, power, and they had made the mistake of thinking she was powerless. Jeremy continued, pulling up another file. I cross-referenced the foreclosure approvals with campaign donations. Turns out Thomas Berkeley, the guy who signed off on your foreclosure, has been getting large deposits funneled into his accounts from a PAC linked to Horizon Equity. He's not just a government employee, he's a paid asset. Elena absorbed the information, the pieces clicking into place. So they find vulnerable properties, manipulate the foreclosure process, erase the owner's legal ties, then scoop everything up at auction for next to nothing. Jeremy nodded grimly. And then they flip the land, using legal shields to avoid liability. By the time anyone figures out what happened, it's too late. She sat back, staring at the screen, rage simmering beneath her calm exterior. This wasn't just about money. This was about taking from people who had already given everything. Soldiers who had been deployed, serving their country, only to come home and find they had been robbed in their absence. And now these bastards were hiding behind corporate structures and legal jargon, counting on their victims to either not notice or not have the resources to fight back. Elena wasn't most people. Jeremy watched her, his sharp gaze assessing. So what's your next move? She stood, rolling her shoulders, shaking off the weight of exhaustion that threatened to settle in. We go after Berkeley first. He's the weak link. Jeremy smirked. I was hoping you'd say that. They didn't waste time. By the next morning, Elena was sitting across from Thomas Berkeley in a quiet cafe, her posture relaxed but her eyes locked onto him like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He looked uncomfortable, shifting in his chair, his fingers curling around his coffee cup with too much force. I don't know what you expect me to tell you, he said, his voice tight. Everything was done legally. Elena tilted her head, studying him. Sure. That's why Horizon Equity's been dumping money into your bank account, right? As a thank you for your hard work. Berkeley's face paled slightly. I don't know what you're talking about. Jeremy slid a folder across the table. These transactions say otherwise. Unless you've got another reason for receiving tens of thousands of dollars from a company that just so happens to benefit from every single override you've approved. Berkeley swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. I have nothing to say to you. Alina leaned in, her voice low, measured. You think they're going to protect you when this blows up? You're just an employee, Berkeley, a disposable asset. The second this hits the wrong set of hands, they'll cut ties so fast you'll be the only one holding the bag. He looked away, his fingers twitching. He knew she was right. She let the silence stretch, then pressed forward. You have one chance to walk away from this with something other than a prison sentence. Give us what we need. Names, records, anything that connects Horizon Equity to the people pulling the strings. Berkeley hesitated, his mind visibly warring between self-preservation and fear. Then, finally, he exhaled shakily and whispered, There's a man. Andrew Lattin. He's the one who gives the orders. I don't know where he is, but he licked his lips. He's not just buying properties. He's moving people. Jeremy frowned. Moving. Berkeley's eyes darted to Alina's, desperate. Some of the homeowners, people who fought back, tried to sue. They didn't just lose their houses, they disappeared. A cold, sharp silence fell over the table. Alina's voice was steady when she spoke. How? Berkeley shook his head. I don't know. I swear. But they're gone. No trails, no records. Just gone. Her grip tightened on the edge of the table, but she didn't let the emotion show on her face. If what he was saying was true, this wasn't just about stolen property anymore. People were being erased. She exhaled through her nose, controlling the rising fire in her chest. Tell me where to find Lattin. Berkeley hesitated. He's not the kind of man you find. He finds you. Jeremy scoffed. Not the answer we were looking for. Berkeley swallowed, then pulled a napkin from the table, scribbling something down before sliding it toward Alina. She looked at it. A date, time, and location. Berkeley's hands trembled slightly. He meets investors there sometimes. If you want to find him, that's your best shot. Alina memorized the information, then stood. If you're lying. I'm not, Berkeley said quickly. And if you're smart, you'll walk away from this. She gave him one last glance before turning toward the door. That's never been my style. By the time she and Jeremy were back in the car, the pieces were falling into place. Jeremy exhaled, running a hand through his hair. This just went from financial fraud to something a hell of a lot bigger. Alina nodded, which means we're getting close. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what they had just learned settling between them. Then Jeremy started the engine, pulling away from the cafe and back onto the open road. They had a name, they had a location, and they were done playing defense. The city stretched wide and sprawling as Alina sat in the passenger seat, watching the darkened streets blur past. Jeremy's fingers tapped against the steering wheel, the weight of what they had learned pressing against both of them like a slow-building storm. The napkin with the date, time, and location was still clenched between her fingers, the ink slightly smudged from the heat of her grip. Andrew Lattin, a name that meant nothing to her an hour ago but now carried the weight of everything that had happened. If Berkeley had been telling the truth, then Lattin wasn't just another middleman funneling properties through fraudulent sales, he was the one making people disappear. That changed everything. Alina had spent years hunting men like him overseas, people who thrived in the shadows, pulling strings, making decisions that ruined lives while staying far enough away to avoid the consequences. They operated under different flags, different motivations, but at the core, they were all the same. She had no doubt that Lattin had calculated every move, had built layers of insulation around himself, had ensured that no one could touch him. But he had made one mistake. He had taken from her. Jeremy pulled into an empty lot a few blocks from the location, cutting the engine. The bar Lattin was set to meet his investors in wasn't some high-end private club or corporate building. It was a small, unassuming spot wedged between a boarded-up laundromat and a payday loan office. No security at the door, no tinted CVs lurking nearby, just a place that catered to men who didn't want to be seen. Jeremy turned to her, voice low. We don't know what we're walking into. This isn't some mid-level paper pusher, Alina. Latin's deep in this, which means he's going to be expecting something eventually. She exhaled slowly, keeping her voice steady. Good. That means he's already thinking about how to cover his tracks. We just need to make sure he doesn't get the chance. Jeremy hesitated. And if he already has a way out? Alina's eyes darkened. Then we take it away from him. She stepped out of the car without waiting for a response, the night air thick and humid. The weight of her service pistol pressed reassuringly against her hip, concealed beneath her jacket. She wasn't here to cause a scene, she was here to confirm, to gather, to watch. And when the time was right, she would act. They entered separately, Jeremy taking a seat at the bar while she moved toward a booth near the back, her eyes adjusting to the dim lighting. The place smelled of old whiskey and desperation, the kind of establishment where deals were made in murmured voices over half-empty glasses. Latin arrived 20 minutes later. Alina recognized him immediately. He was older than she expected, early 60s, dressed in an expensive but understated suit, the kind worn by men who wanted to show wealth without drawing attention. His presence commanded quiet authority, the type of man who never had to raise his voice because people listened the first time. He didn't come alone. Two men flanked him, both dressed in casual clothing but carrying themselves like professionals. Security, not bodyguards. Men who had been trained. Jeremy shifted slightly at the bar, eyes flicking toward her, confirming he had spotted them too. Alina leaned back in her seat, letting the shadows keep her concealed as she watched Latin slide into a booth, greeting a man already seated there. She couldn't hear their conversation over the low murmur of the bar, but she didn't need to. The way the man across from him kept glancing around, his fingers tapping nervously against his glass, told her everything she needed to know. He was being pressured. Latin listened, occasionally nodding, his expression impassive. And then, without warning, he leaned forward, his posture shifting slightly. The man across from him froze, swallowing hard before looking away. A decision had been made, though Alina didn't know what. She barely had time to process it before one of Latin's security men stood, his gaze sweeping over the room. She turned slightly, making sure the shadows of the booth kept her in place, but it didn't matter, he had spotted Jeremy. The man leaned toward Latin, whispering something, and in an instant, the entire mood of the room shifted. Latin didn't turn his head, but his fingers tapped once against the table, a subtle but deliberate movement. The message was clear. They were leaving. Jeremy pushed off from the bar, moving casually toward the exit as if he had seen enough. It was the smart move, drawing attention to himself now would only make things worse. But Latin's men weren't about to let him go so easily. Alina was already moving. By the time Jeremy stepped outside, the two security men followed. She slipped out the side door, cutting through the alley, emerging just in time to see one of them grab Jeremy's arm, his posture tense, his grip too tight to be casual. She didn't hesitate. She was behind them in seconds, pressing her pistol against the base of the man's skull before he even realized she was there. "Let him go," she said, her voice quiet, calm. The man stiffened, his grip loosening slightly. His partner turned, reaching for something beneath his jacket, but Jeremy was already there, his own weapon drawn, aimed directly at the man's ribs. Alina pressed the barrel harder against the man's skull. "I won't ask twice." Slowly, carefully he released Jeremy's arm, his hands rising slightly. Jeremy exhaled through his nose. That was fast. Alina didn't move. "Tell Latin we'll be in touch." The man hesitated. "You don't know who you're messing with." She smiled, though there was nothing warm about it. "Neither do you." She stepped back, lowering her weapon but not holstering it. They wouldn't make a move now, not when the street was still too exposed, too unpredictable. Latin was too careful for that. They walked away, neither looking back. Jeremy exhaled as they rounded the corner, glancing at her. Well, that escalated. Alina's expression was unreadable. "We rattled him." "Yeah, and now he knows we're watching." She nodded, her grip tightening around the weapon in her hand. Good. Latin was smart, careful, and dangerous, But for the first time, he was also worried. And that meant he would make a mistake. Alina sat in the darkened motel room, her back against the cold wooden chair, the glow of Jeremy's laptop illuminating the wall in flickering intervals as documents scrolled across the screen. The air was thick with tension, the kind that settled into your bones when you were too close to something that had the potential to unravel everything. Latin had made a mistake. It wasn't obvious, wasn't blatant, but it was there. She had spent years dissecting strategies, tracking movement patterns, understanding the psychology of men who operated in shadows. They always thought they were untouchable until the moment they realized they weren't. And Latin, for all his power and influence, had reached that moment. Jeremy exhaled sharply, fingers flying over the keyboard, his expression unreadable. Latin's accounts have been shifting money in the last 48 hours. It's not a full-burn operation yet, but he's moving liquid assets into offshore accounts. He's preparing for an exit. Alina barely blinked. Then we force his hand. Jeremy gave a dry, humorless laugh. You make it sound easy. She didn't answer. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing about this had been easy, but Latin's pattern was predictable now. He thought he had control, but they had taken it from him the second they made him react. His men had tried to send a message outside that bar, and it had backfired. Now, he wasn't just worried about exposure, he was scrambling, trying to plug holes in a dam that was already cracking. Jeremy glanced at her, his voice lower now. You realize if we push him too hard, he won't hesitate to bury this deeper. People who operate at his level don't just run. They erase threats. You, me, we're threats now. Alina met his gaze. Then we make sure there's nothing left for him to erase. Jeremy sighed, leaning back, rubbing his hands over his face. What are you thinking? She exhaled, rolling her shoulders, feeling the weight of exhaustion creeping in but refusing to let it settle. We need a location. Not just some corporate office or safe house, something he considers untouchable. A place where he keeps the real files, the real records. The offshore accounts are a contingency. But he still needs leverage. He's still here because he thinks he can control this. We take that away from him, we end this. Jeremy didn't argue. He didn't need to. He just turned back to the screen, pulling up every bit of information they had on Latin's network, cross-referencing financial transactions, property deeds, business fronts. The hours bled together, the hum of the laptop the only sound in the room. And then finally Jeremy sat up straighter. Air. Alina leaned in, scanning the screen. A warehouse, tucked into an industrial district on the outskirts of the city, listed under a defunct logistics company tied to one of Horizon Equity's subsidiaries. Jeremy tapped the screen. It's been active. Power's running, security logs show recent access, and there's an encrypted server on site. Whatever he's keeping off the books, it's in there. Alina was already grabbing her jacket. Jeremy blinked. We're really doing this. She looked at him. We didn't come this far to stop now. The warehouse was quiet when they arrived. The kind of quiet that made your instincts go razor sharp, every sense heightened, waiting for something to break the silence. They moved quickly, keeping to the shadows, watching for security, for patrols, but there were none. No guards, no cameras, nothing but the low hum of industrial lighting bleeding through the metal seams of the building. Jeremy muttered under his breath, "This feels wrong." Alina didn't disagree. It was too easy. Latin wasn't sloppy. If this place had real leverage, it should have been guarded. He should have expected them to come looking. She reached the side door, testing the handle. It wasn't locked. Jeremy exhaled sharply. This is a trap. Alina pulled her weapon, steady and controlled. Probably. And then she pushed the door open. The interior was vast, rows of metal shelves stacked high with unmarked boxes, the scent of dust and oil thick in the air. A single desk sat in the middle of the space, a computer monitor still glowing faintly. Jeremy moved to the desk, fingers hovering over the keyboard. This is it. Alina scanned the room, muscles coiled tight. Something was wrong. The silence wasn't normal. The openness wasn't normal. Jeremy started typing, pulling files, decrypting storage logs. There are records here, everything. House seizures, payment logs, kickbacks to judges, local politicians. He has everyone on his payroll. Alina's pulse quickened. They had it. The proof. Jeremy's voice sharpened. He's laundering people through financial records. The disappearances, he's marking them as asset liquidation. Her stomach turned. How many? Jeremy's fingers froze over the keys. At least 50, maybe more. Alina clenched her jaw, shoving the rage down, focusing. Download everything. Now. Jeremy nodded, inserting a flash drive, data transferring rapidly. But before it could finish, a voice rang out from the upper level of the warehouse. I was wondering when you'd finally show up. Alina's blood ran cold. Andrew Lattin stepped into view, dressed as if he had just walked out of a boardroom meeting, completely at ease. He wasn't alone. Two men flanked him, hands resting casually on concealed weapons. Alina turned slightly, keeping her body between Jeremy and them. You're running out of places to hide. Lattin chuckled, shaking his head. You think you've won? You think whatever's on that drive means anything? He took a slow step forward. There is no record. No one is going to come save you. No one is going to fight this battle for you. Alina's grip tightened on her weapon. We don't need saving. Lattin smirked. You still don't get it. You think this is just about money? About property? This is about control. And you're in a game you don't even understand. Jeremy's voice was quiet behind her. Downloads complete. Lattin sighed. Shame, and then he gave a subtle nod. The first gunshot shattered the silence. Alina moved. She shoved Jeremy behind cover as she fired, dropping the first man before he could get off a second shot. Jeremy scrambled, grabbing the drive, shoving it into his pocket as they dove behind a row of crates. Bullets ripped through the air, splintering wood, echoing through the space. Lattin was gone, his security pulling him back even as his men tried to pin them down. Alina gritted her teeth. We need to move. Jeremy nodded, breathing hard. Back exit, she laid down cover fire as they sprinted toward the door, the sound of footsteps retreating as Lattin's men pulled back, regrouping. They weren't chasing them. They didn't need to. By the time they reached the car, Jeremy was already calling in their backup plan, sending the files to a dozen locations, making sure this didn't disappear into the void. Alina stared at the warehouse in the rearview mirror, her jaw tight. This wasn't over. Not yet. The sky was beginning to lighten when Alina and Jeremy finally pulled into the outskirts of the city, the weight of everything that had transpired pressing against them like a storm that hadn't yet broken. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving only the raw edge of exhaustion, but neither of them were ready to stop. The flash drive in Jeremy's pocket wasn't just a collection of documents, it was the smoking gun, the final piece that tied Lattin, Horizon Equity, and every corrupt official they had bought off into a single, undeniable truth. They had everything, and now came the most dangerous part: what to do with it. Jeremy exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face as he pulled into the parking lot of a safe house he had set up years ago, an old warehouse repurposed as a secure hideout. It wasn't much to look at, just another forgotten building on the fringes of a city that was constantly growing and consuming, but it was enough. They had what they needed. Now they just had to make sure it didn't disappear. Alina stepped out of the car, her muscles aching from the hours of tension, but her mind was still moving, calculating. She had been in situations like this before, high-stakes operations where the right move could dismantle an entire network, and the wrong one could get you buried. Lattin hadn't pursued them when they fled the warehouse. That wasn't a retreat. That was strategy. He had let them take the information because he was already working to counter it, to discredit it before they could use it. Jeremy pulled out his laptop, booting it up as Alina scanned the area, every instinct on high alert. We can't take this straight to the authorities, he said, voice edged with frustration. If even half the people on this list are as dirty as they look, someone will bury this before it ever reaches the right hands. She knew he was right. Corruption didn't just exist in people, it existed in systems, in the way power protected itself. If they handed this over to law enforcement, it wouldn't be an investigation. It would be a cover-up. Then we go public, she said, turning back to him. Jeremy hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. That's a big gamble. She met his eyes, unwavering. Latin built this network by making people disappear. By controlling the narrative, we take that away from him, we force his hand. Jeremy considered it, then nodded. I'll start encrypting copies. We'll send it to journalists, watchdog groups, federal agencies outside of the state. If we spread it far enough, no one can stop it. Alina nodded, but she wasn't just thinking about Latin's political connections. She was thinking about the people who had vanished. Berkeley had told them that some of the homeowners had disappeared after trying to fight back. There was no official record of them, no missing persons reports that had gained traction. If the financial records were any indication, they had been wiped clean, just like her mortgage, just like her ownership of the house. She turned to Jeremy. Latin didn't just steal homes, he erased people. We need to find out where they went. Jeremy frowned, shifting his focus. If he was laundering properties, it's possible he was laundering identities too. Let me dig. Alina paced as he worked, her mind racing. Latin had operated with impunity for years because no one had ever dug deep enough. The judges, the housing board, the corporate executives, they had all benefited from the system he created, but he was the one who had built it piece by piece. And now, for the first time, it was falling apart. Minutes stretched into an hour before Jeremy finally spoke, his voice sharp with realization. Got something. Alina moved to his side, scanning the screen as he pulled up satellite images, old property records, and a series of financial transactions that led to a remote location just outside city limits. It was a private facility, listed under a medical research foundation with vague funding sources, but the deeper Jeremy dug, the clearer it became this wasn't a hospital. It was a holding site. A place where people had been sent, removed from public records, stripped of their identities. Alina's pulse quickened. We need to go there. Now. Jeremy hesitated. Alina, if Latin has a place like this, it's not just a paper trail we're following. This is where he keeps the people who fought back. This could be he didn't finish, but she knew what he was thinking. This could be dangerous. This could be lethal. She met his gaze. Then we don't give him the chance to clean it up. They drove in silence, the tension thick between them, the weight of what they were about to do settling like a stone in Alina's chest. She had faced enemies before, terrorists, insurgents, men with guns and bombs and the willingness to die for their cause. But this was different. This was systematic, a slow and methodical form of destruction that had been built into the very fabric of the system. Latin hadn't needed bullets or threats. He had needed signatures and silence. The facility was located off a back road, hidden behind acres of fenced-off land. It didn't look like much from the outside, just another anonymous building with no signage, no indication of what was inside. But Alina didn't need a sign to know what this place was. Jeremy killed the headlights as they approached, parking a quarter-mile away. Security, he asked quietly. Alina scanned the perimeter. There were cameras, but no obvious guards, no patrols. Latin had built this on secrecy, not brute force. That meant getting in wouldn't be the hard part. Getting out would. They moved quickly, slipping through a gap in the fence, keeping low as they approached the side entrance. The door was locked with an electronic keycard system, but Jeremy was already working, pulling a small device from his bag, bypassing the security in less than a minute. The door clicked open. Alina went first, weapon drawn, heart pounding as they stepped inside. The air was sterile, cold, the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound. The hallways were empty, the walls lined with numbered doors, each one locked, each one leading to someone who had disappeared. Jeremy moved to the nearest terminal, working fast. They're here, he whispered, voice tight. Some of them. Not all. Alina turned to the nearest door, testing the lock. It was secure. She glanced back at Jeremy. Can you open them? He nodded, already working. But once I do, Latin will know. We won't have much time. Alina's jaw tightened. Then do it. The locks released with a quiet click, and then the doors started to open. The people inside stepped out cautiously, faces gaunt, eyes filled with confusion and fear. Some had been missing for weeks, others for months, but they were alive. Alina turned back to Jeremy. We need to get them out. Footsteps echoed down the hall. The first shot rang out. Jeremy grabbed the laptop, shoving it into his bag. Alina fired back, dropping the first guard before he could get off another shot. The others were already moving, shouting into radios, realizing too late that their facility had been compromised. They ran, guiding the former captives toward the exit, covering their retreat as bullets ricocheted off the walls. They hit the doors at full speed, spilling out into the night. Sirens wailed in the distance. Jeremy gasped. "You called the cops?" Alina shook her head. "No," and then she saw them, federal agents swarming the perimeter. The files had made it through. Latin's empire was burning, and for the first time since this started, Alina knew they had won.